Welcome, everybody, from the Honors College. I'm Linda Kuhn, Dean of the Honors College, and it's my great pleasure to launch the first sneak preview of our series signature seminars in the spring of 2022. We're super excited about both of them. So tonight we're going to get a taste of Euclid, about which I'll speak in a minute. And a week from today, Professor Foster, who's with us tonight, will be giving a sneak preview of her class on economic thought and competition law in the ancient world through the Middle Ages, which also will be fascinating and creepy. Just saying, that's my plug. But tonight, I also have with us the brand new dean of our amazing University of Arkansas Libraries, Jason Battle, who is going to introduce the first member of the teaching team for the spring 2022 signature seminar, Euclid. Take it away, Jason.
Thank you, Linda. I appreciate it very much. This is week 5 for me here in Fayetteville and have had a wonderful time so far. Lots of things going on at the libraries. If you haven't visited, I encourage you to come by. Floors 3 and 4 completely renovated, and we're getting set to do more here. But more about that later. Right now, I'm here to introduce Joshua Youngblood, who is the Rare Books Librarian and head of the Special Collections Unit for Outreach and Instruction. Joshua, this class is something that I know that he has been working on with Dr. Harris for a bit. Joshua does great work in exhibits and special collections and also is recognized by his peers in the field. He's very recently been the president of the Society of Southwest Archivists, and we are so happy to have him be able to participate as a Dean's Fellow with the Honors College in presenting this class. He is the first Dean's Fellow that the libraries have had with the Honors College, and we hope not the last. And so we're grateful for him to be here and interested to hear what he and Dr. Harris have to say.
All right, thank you, Dean Battles. And yeah, there's no escape from us. We will be after you for more faculty, so don't worry about that. And it's my pleasure to introduce the second member of this super interdisciplinary teaching team, which combines mathematics, the history of mathematics, the history of the book, and classical studies, and you name it, and it's super. People talk about interdisciplinary, but this is actually interdisciplinary. Euclid being at the center of all these things, and as you will learn, is still with us and haunting many of our visual paces in the contemporary world. So what am I going to say, Edmund? If you want to know Edmund, come to the Honors College courtyard and see the large mathematical, beautiful form that is decorating our space called a curvahedra, designed by Professor Edmund Harris and in architecture, Emily Baker. It's amazing, and it combines art and geometry, and I think that's where we see the sort of seedbed of this Euclid class: design, art, history, and geometry. But, well, I don't know, Edmund, what are you? Mathematician, artist, loving to teach young children mathematics, or as he likes to say, corrupting people into mathematical thinking? Who says that? Who has had his publications and honors all over the globe, appearing in the New Scientist, NPR, The Guardian, and Numberphile. He has a lot of his artistic work installed in addition to the fabulous Honors College courtyard. Also at Imperial College in London, that suits you, Imperial, yep. And in other places. Well, anyway, he kind of shakes things up in the world of mathematics. And I think with Joshua Youngblood, who also shakes things up in the world of rare books, you're in for an amazing treat. And notice they're both deep in the bowels of special collections. That's kind of creepy. So I'm going to shut up now and turn it over to Professors Youngblood and Harris. Take it away, y'all.
Okay, thank you so much, Dean Battles and Dean Kuhn. Those wonderful introductions. I'll also say of Dr. Harris before I turn the mic over to him. He's also a great lover of books, which is partly where this class has come from, is that our shared love of books and information over time. So what we're going to do today, and I'm giving a little bit of a preface to it because we're going to have to be tech savvy to do it. We are going to swap PowerPoint as we trade the microphone back and forth. And so we're going to mute and unmute, but then we're also going to go back and forth. And so Dr. Harris is going to begin us with, well, I'll let him begin in just a second, and then we will hopefully weave our way forward in time and maybe backwards a few times as well. And one of the things we're hoping to do, which I know we will do this at least, is showcase the interdisciplinary nature of Euclid and what students have in store for them. So with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Harris.
All right, well, welcome everybody, and thank you for all those lovely words. And I want to start with a piece of rope. And if you think about this, I mean, this is quite a small piece of rope, but I have to hold it on a screen. But you could think about this being really as up to fairly large scale. And there's a couple of things I can do with it. I can hold it completely tight. And if I do hold it completely tight, I can then start to move around, keeping one point fixed. And when I do those two things, I can create a straight line between the 2 points that I'm holding tight. And then I can create a circle by rotating and fixing one point and letting the other one move. And as I said, you can do this with a large rope. So you can do this at significant scale. So if you're wanting to build large scale construction, and all you have is a rope, you can actually do a lot. Let's see what might be possible. So that is not the right window. So the tech, here we go. So imagine these two dots are 2 points. And as I said, with a rope or a ruler or straight edge, I can create a line between them. And then I actually have two different choices of circle. I can choose either point to be the center and rotate the other one around. This gives me two circles. And when I look at those two circles, I get a new point, and I can join both of my original points to this new point. And I get an equilateral triangle. Well, how do I know that this is an equilateral triangle? Well, I might choose to have the rule that what is the meaning of a circle? Well, a circle is all the points that are a certain distance from a given point, the center of that circle. And so I know, this is my original line, I know all the points on this circle are the same distance away. And so this edge here is the same length as my original edge. And vice versa, if I take this different circle, all the points on this circle are the same distance from this point, which is this line's worth. And so this line is the same length as this line. Now I actually have to use another rule here. I have to use the rule that if this line is the same length as this line, and this line is also the same length as this line, then they must be as well the same length as each other. That might seem to be something that's obvious, but one of the ideas that you explore when looking at Euclid is that you basically have to set down the rules. There's a set of rules that you start with, and those are all the arguments that you can make. And there are things like the nature of a circle that I discussed, but also things like if two different things are the same length as a third thing, then they are also the same length as each other. So you have to be very careful in what the rules are. and you can't just sort of make obvious points. You can only make points within those lines. Now, what I've just given, this construction of the equilateral triangle, is the first proposition, the first thing after those basic rules that Euclid presents. I actually want to move on quite a bit further in book 1 of Euclid to proposition 46, because as you go through, you build more and more systems that you can use out of the basic rules. It all comes back to what you can do with ruler and compass, with that rope, but you can build up more and more complicated methods. And to see how this might work, it actually makes more sense not to look at the early propositions, but to look at one of the later ones. And so book 1, proposition 46, allows us to construct a square on any edge. So I've got my 2 endpoints and my edge. And so following Euclid, I first need to use book 1, proposition 11. In order to do that, I firstly need to use book 1, proposition 3, which allows me to construct 2 lines of equal length away from this end point. And I can then use the proposition I've already shown you, the first proposition, to construct an equilateral triangle on where the base is given by those 2 points, which were an equal distance from the point I started with. That then allows me to construct, through the intersection of those circles and this point, a line at right angles to my starting line. I now go on to another bit of construction. I want to use, I want to create a square, so I want the 2 edges to be the same length. So I can use a circle to, on my perpendicular, on my line at right angles, I can find the point the same distance as the edge that I already have. And now I want to use book 1, proposition 31, which constructs a line parallel to a given line through a point. So I want to construct a line parallel to this one through this point here. In order to do that, I have to use book 1, proposition 23, which allows me to make the same angle at a different point. So I have the angle between this line and this line. I want to make that angle again, but up here. In order to do that, I need to use proposition 22, construct a triangle from 3 edge lengths. And so I have here, this is my triangle. You can see the 3 edge lengths. I'm going to mark those 3 as circles. I'm not going to show it, but there's actually proposition 2 allows you to move a length and thus a circle from one point to another. It involves several steps of its own, including constructing an equilateral triangle. But that does actually make things a little bit too messy. So we end up recreating our triangle up here, and that recreates our 90-degree angle. And from this, we get our square. And so you see here some of the flavor of what is in Euclid from the point of view of geometry. You lay out some very basic rules about how your tools of a straight line and a circle can work. And then you start putting them together and you can get to more and more sophisticated ideas and objects. And a set of high points for the sort of mathematics you start to explore. So book 1, the big climactic result, the final result of that is Pythagoras' theorem. I think one of the things as you study Euclid's elements, at least to me, you realize that it's got some rhythm to it. It does come to a climax. There are sort of big events that happen, but you have to be watching carefully to see them, because the propositions can roll on. You get one proof and then another proof. And there's a lot of sort of technical filler pieces where you're building tools that you use to make tools rather than things which are describable in their own rights. And then you hit this big result, like Pythagoras' theorem. I mean, I'm using the name Pythagoras' theorem because that's the way we commonly use it, but it's one of the ancient results. It's sort of seen in many, many different cultures as one of the first results of abstract thinking, as well as something of practical use, because it can help you find a right angle. So I showed you the construction of a square, but you can also construct a regular pentagon and hexagon. In fact, you can see a page of Euclid doing exactly that construction on the right. The climax of the whole book, the whole thing, the final results are the construction of the 5 regular polyhedra in 3 dimensions, these beautiful objects. I don't have pictures of them, which is probably a mistake, but they are they are these 3-dimensional versions of regular shapes. So other things that you can find, book 1, proposition 4, the favorite of the algebra classroom, that a plus b squared is equal to a squared plus 2ab plus b squared, but not dealt with as an algebraic manipulation, dealt with as a geometric operation. So it goes well beyond just geometry. And I think in particular, there's a lot of number theory in there, including the lovely result that the square root of 2 cannot be written as a fraction with whole numbers top and bottom, that number is irrational, and that there are an infinite number of prime numbers. So what you get from Euclid is this amazing construction of mathematics, as well as an overview of a significant proportion of the mathematical knowledge of a particular place and time. And that I will pass over to Joshua.
Okay, thank you. And I will share my screen. And so the book that Dr. Harris just had on his screen at last time comes from the 19th century. Euclid, of course, comes from way, way earlier than that. And all of those ideas that he just used to build those shapes and to logically get us to that understanding of the line and the triangle and the square and the circle were collected first 300 BCE. So Euclid's Elements, the main book we're talking about, the person that was Euclid wrote at least 3 books that have survived in some form. And there are multiple other fragments here and there. But that book, The Elements, has had quite a reign. And to quote the mathematician and math historian and classicist Thomas Heath, no work presumably except the Bible has had such a reign. And future generations will come back to it again and again as they tire of the variegated substitutes for it and the confusion arising from the bewildering multiplicity. So as Dr. Harris began with a rope, I'll begin with a piece of papyrus over on the left here. This is one of the earliest extant examples that we have of the elements. This is the Oxyrhynchus papyrus that is dated from approximately 100 AD. And to the right over there is not a papyrus, the other material that we'll talk about a lot in the class and we'll talk about today, which is vellum, and that is the Vatican manuscript of pre-Theon text, which wasn't identified until the 19th century. So the Elements had thousands of editions over those more than 2,000 years around, and they went through many different forms, and they had knowledge added to it, they had explication added to it, there were things lost, there was transfer of it over time. I begin with these 2 images, this ephemeral piece of papyri from Alexandria, for a number of reasons. One is it's cool and it's old. and it shows the diagramming. But it also speaks to a couple of important things. One of which is that this person, Euclid, that wrote the Elements was not Greek necessarily, although he was from the Greek world, he was from Alexandria. And I say he with a little bit of caution. Euclid was from Alexandria, and this piece of papyrus was also from Alexandria. But you can see that it was discovered in a rubbish heap in the late 19th century, rubbish heap in big quotes, through British archaeological digs as they sought to control and excavate and then bring together information from across the imperial world. The Vatican manuscript on your right was 9th century in its construction, but wasn't incorporated into the scholarship, the larger scholarship on Euclid until at the very earliest, the 16th century, and not really until the 19th century because it was inaccessible in lots of ways. Both of these objects are now fully digitized and are available to anyone to look at. They are not available in the library. We have lots of other really interesting examples of Euclid that students can look at and scholars can come visit and the public can use, but these are available out there. So Euclid had a long history through lots of editions, and it also traveled across the world. And in some ways, as the scholar Murdoch would say, it was unique in its ubiquity. Murdoch, the math historian, has actually said that Euclid was unique in how many times it was adapted through the medieval period and how many changes it underwent. And importantly, how every time it was transcribed and translated, the changes came with it. And it got richer and richer over time, but also carried some mysteries or mistakes or misunderstandings with it. On the left here, we see the Arabic translation of Euclid's Elements as revised by the Persian mathematician Nasr al-Din al-Tusi. This is a manuscript from 1258. In the center is the manuscript which contains Adelard's Euclid. And Adelard was the British scholar who first translated Euclid back into Latin from Arabic after finding a manuscript or discovering a manuscript or being allowed access to a manuscript in Constantinople, because the Western European world had largely lost touch with Euclid in its study. And so after it was translated back into Latin, it began to be studied again. And on the right, we have a 13th century French manuscript. And then this is further illumination or work based on the Adelard or Bath's translation. And you can see the diagrams that come with it, the diagrams as they are adjusted, diagrams made onto the vellum, onto these leather leaves, however they could possibly be made, some more refined, some less refined. But the character of the text changed over time, just as the text was transmitted over time. And Euclid makes it to the Renaissance era, and the Renaissance book and how book changed during the Renaissance is very important for Euclid, and then how we have Euclid now. These two images are actually from the 1537 edition of Euclid, published in Basel, published by Johann Herbagen, that we have here in Mullins Library in special collections, and the students will get to work with this. And these two images are great for a number of reasons. I love them just because you can see the work of the woodgrave engraving to make the initials. You can also see how the beautiful initials in this edition is right alongside the diagrams. If you were to really study just these two images and not even look at the rest of the book, you could also see citations to previous works. You could see choices that were made by craftsmen. You could see what was made for aesthetic reasons, what was made for practical reasons, what was made so that people could come to this text in later years. In the first printed edition of Euclid is 1482. It's the Rathold edition, published in Venice. And then several editions later, we get to our 1537, but the printed book, the printed representation of Euclid changes quickly as book technology in Europe evolves. Books become a commodity. Books reach new people. Books are accessed and consumed and used in different ways. Through these print editions of Euclid from the Renaissance and then carrying forward, including in our wonderful 1537 that we have, we also have some of the mythology of Euclid, which is misplaced, or some of the mythology of Euclid that is creating a character or an idea of the elements and the learning in there that maybe is not connected or contextualized to who the real person was and all of the things that came before it. Many Renaissance Euclids refer to the Euclid Megarian. So this is Euclid from Megara, as the European books make him a Greek person instead of someone from Alexandria. It's Euclid of Alexandria. And so many of the editions of Euclid in the 15th, 16th, 17th, into the 18th century even will refer to Euclid of Megara. And so Euclid as an object is being Europeanized, and Euclid as an idea and the elements is lifted in some ways away from scholarship, even at the same time as it becomes essential to education and development of the university system. And so with that, I will hand it back over to Dr. Harris.
Thank you. And taking on that idea that Euclid was an idea, Euclid became this sort of almost ideal point, is a good place to go back to think about what I was talking about with having a system of rules and having to work just within that system of rules. Once you've established the rules, what can you create within that world you've created through those rules? And this is sometimes called the axiomatic method. And it is something that is sort of shown initially in Euclid. Euclid is one of the oldest versions we have of those sorts of ideas. And in the 19th century, that became at the heart of the way that mathematicians started to try to conceive of the subject. It's a story which is too long for today, but in the 19th century, the notion of the foundations of mathematics was sort of threatened. People weren't sure exactly what mathematics was in very sort of many different ways. And the axiomatic method was one of the ways that people saw to escape from that, and drawing on Euclid. So how did Euclid fare when the axiomatic method started to become taken really seriously again? And it wasn't given the respect as an ideal, but it started to be studied within the context of the ideal it itself sort of influenced. And at this stage, I sort of pass over to Bertrand Russell. And I don't know exactly Russell's accent, but I can do a posh British accent, so there's good value in that. It has become customary when Euclid, considered as a textbook, is attacked for his verbosity or his obscurity or his pedantry, to defend him on the ground that his logical excellence is transcendent and informs an invaluable training to the youthful powers of reasoning. This claim, however, vanishes on a close inspection. His definitions do not always define. His axioms are not always indemonstrable. His demonstrations require many axioms of which he is quite unconscious. Separately in the same article, the fourth proposition is a tissue of nonsense. The above definite fallacies seemed sufficient to show that the value of his work as a masterpiece of logic has been very grossly exaggerated. So something interesting is happening here. When Euclid starts to be studied as a text in its own right again, rather than as an ideal, it quickly falls apart in some ways. And I think it's worth noting here that this is not the language of somebody who is noting problems in the text. This is someone who is betrayed by the errors that he is finding there. And as one of the people who was sort of working hardest to try to build mathematics on these axiomatic grounds, and was inspired in his love of mathematics by Euclid, I think you're hearing Russell's dramatic language here is showing that sense of betrayal almost, that Euclid didn't hold up to the ridiculous standards that it had been held to. And this sort of leads us into a, we don't want the course, what we don't want the course to be about. It's not going to be a course about setting up the grand work of Euclid, but a course about looking at this text and ideally helping to understand why Russell might feel so betrayed by the text not living up to the high ideals and goals that it itself had set up. And with that, back to Joshua.
Okay. But after all, it was just a textbook, the most successful textbook, the longest published textbook, maybe the earliest thing that we could call a textbook, but Euclid is just a textbook. And to quote the bibliographer who, writing in the 1920s, studied all of the early editions, lamenting how it's so hard to find the well-used copies. Some, especially the more insignificant, are a great rarity, perhaps because they are largely used by school boards. On the book that you see on the screen is our 1607 copy of Euclid. We've had this copy in our university library since 1942, as it was acquired with Ancient Languages funds, and it now is in special collections. And even now, it sees lots of use by students, especially every time that we have a math class here, but every time we need to show that books can be considered sacred, they can be reverential, but they don't have to be considered that way. This is just a 1607 copy of a very large textbook, which I affectionately refer to as the brick, because of its weight and dimensions. And it is a later printing of the Clavius Euclid, which would have been in great circulation in the late 1500s and early 1600s. And this is not even one of their more remarkable printings. Is it a remarkable object? Absolutely. As you can see on the spine labels, if you go in and look at the way the text has been used, and to compare the text with other editions, and also to think about how it existed in historical and social context. And so I'm going to back up just a second to look at a close-up of that initial, which I had on, I showed you from the Herwagen 1537 Euclid. And this is the Job initial. And so even as Euclid becomes an abstract idea and text that can be criticized and analyzed over the centuries, as Dr. Harris was referring to, it has a dual life, especially in England and in Western European countries, where it symbolizes the ideal, the ideals of education, a purity of thought. At the same time, it is something that is used and is something that is essential to schooling. So this Job initial in this 1537 illustrates this balance between Christian culture, classical influences, about the complexities of a social situation that would create a book like this. I have a strong suspicion, and I am still researching, that these initials in the 1537 were designed by none other than Hans Holbein, who created the most important portrait of Erasmus, who was also a friend of Erasmus, and he was in the same circle in Basel that produced this book in the 1537. And so these books come out of a certain context. And while they are beautiful, note my cotton gloves as I take the pretty picture of the book open to the Pythagoras Theorem, or the Pythagorean Theorem, in the 1537. And of course, we take great care of it, but it's important to remember that as beautiful as this folio edition is, it was just something constructed to be used and to be used by different people. And because of its use, because of its understanding, because of the way it's interpreted and corrected, the text itself transforms still through time, even through the print age and up to the modern period. And so these images here, the top left is from the 1607 Clavius, the brick. On the right there is a Simpson Euclid from the early 19th century, also from our university library's rare books collection, which was acquired for the Mass Library before it came over to rare books some decades ago. And then down below is a book, Recreations in Mathematics and Natural Philosophy, which of course incorporates Euclidean concepts, Euclidean geometry from the early 19th century, but it's a book that's supposed to help people explore mathematical concepts without having them dictated to them. So as the additions through the Renaissance into the early modern period and into the modern period are produced, the book both goes from tome to textbook, but then it also grapples with the weight of being considered divine or being a central pillar of kind of cultural identity. And so I like to call part of this process when Euclid becomes English, and it becomes essential to the English schooling system. And I will say things that perhaps Dr. Harris could add greater cultural depth and context to. But Euclid does get translated into English and then becomes an important book that then goes through the changes of the society, even as it becomes symbolic of the growing English imperial presence and the spread of United Kingdom's power across the world. The first English edition is the Billingsley Euclid, first translated into English in 1570. You note that it still refers to it as the Euclid of Megara. Billingsley actually used a Theon Greek edition. So it both shows changes away from the Adelaide or Bath reliance on the Latin transcriptions and translations. It does incorporate some Greek, but it's still a Theon, which is has some changes added in the 4th century AD. So you have the Billingsley in 1507 and subsequent English editions, including the Isaac Barrett Euclid Elements, the whole 15 books. There are only 13, but the whole 15 books compendiously demonstrated, 1660. Barrow's interesting because he was self-taught in geometry. And so his work in creating an edition was to allow other people to teach themselves, to make the text itself more accessible. And he was trying to create what ended up becoming a standard, simplified edition. Latin 1655, English 1678. And I have a book slightly before that down at the bottom, Andrea Tackett's Elementary Geometria, 1654. But I put this on here because of all of the 8th editions that come from here. Tackett, who is a Jesuit, wrote his version explicitly for school children. The 8th edition actually includes quotes from Barrow, just above on my citation list here, and Barrow referring to the divine nature of God and how the divine nature of God can be seen in the beauty and purity of thought of Euclid, and how we can all touch the divine wisdom of God by studying Euclid. But British culture changes and books change as well. By the early 1700s, by the early 18th century, studying the elements was expected of all British gentlemen. And I say gentlemen very directly there. You were supposed to be familiar with it, even if you weren't engaging with it at a deeper level, or you weren't performing your own experimentation or exploration of mathematics. You were supposed to know how to think like Euclid. By the early 19th century, the book market is changing again. Some rare books historians would say that there had been 2 centuries of decline in the beauty of the British book. I won't be that harsh. There are important innovations in the 1700s with British books, including the invention of wove paper, which made books less expensive to produce. So wove paper not being laid cotton paper, allowing improvements in abilities to mass produce paper. By the early 19th century, you have presses who are doing beautiful work, creating aesthetically pleasing books that are also explicitly intended to be directed to a broader market. And 2 that are really important for us to think about in Euclid is William Pickering's press and the Chisek press. And so William Pickering, both of these actually publish a book that we will talk about in great detail in the class. But William Pickering Press invented cloth binding, among other things, and was able to produce books that are durable, but are also accessible price-wise. This page here with a poem by William Blake about the divine image comes from the edition of Songs of Innocence and Experience. Note how clean this paper looks. how nice of a book this is, even though it doesn't have Blake's images in it. But this was the Pickering edition, first edition, without images of Blake. Blake was so scarce and hard to get a hold of that most people would not have read Blake until it was put into a more accessible title. On the lower right is the Book of Common Prayer Noted. And this is an example of Chisek's press and the beautiful engraving they were doing. So Chisek was a press founded by Charles Whittingham, who was from a common background. He was a farmer who, after he went through an apprenticeship in the book trade, began to think we should take the most important notable books that are out there and just make them available to everybody. And he was so successful in creating accessible, cheap issues that some booksellers said they wouldn't sell his books anymore. So he had to adapt. As his son came on board, his son said, why don't we go back and look at some of the most beautiful examples of British books, some of the great innovations like engraved initials and the capitals and title pages, and make our books really, really great. And they also pioneered the idea of facsimile copies. So Pickering Press and Chisek working together created the idea of the beautiful facsimiles to allow scarce or hard to get works to actually be in more libraries and in more hands. And I want to talk in particular about one person that worked for the Chisek Press and was involved in creating our Euclid. So I mentioned earlier how important Euclid was for the English gentlemen to have in their educational background by the early 1700s. It was not thought that women could handle the stress and rigor of Euclid, though. But when it came time to create the beautiful Byrne Euclid, or to create other examples of great facsimiles and references back to the high points of British bookmaking, Mary Byfield is just one example of the type of expertise used to make these books. We know very little about her other than that she and her brother both worked for Chisek Press for their entire lives. She was associated with the Whittinghams, who had founded the press for more than 40 years. But she also designed the the engraved initials that wind up in our Burns Euclid that Dr. Harris showed you at the very beginning. It was on my first slide. She also happened to be the person entrusted with recreating Hans Holbein's designs for the facsimile edition of his famous Dance of Death, originally published in the 16th century in Basel. So that gets us to Oliver Byrne, who is the person who created that book. Oliver Byrne was an Irishman born in County Wicklow. He is publishing by the age of 20. He was a prolific publisher over his lifetime, publishing in civil engineering, mathematics, education, and all sorts of other things. He, at times, was employed as a math professor, although he apparently had trouble holding jobs sometimes and moved around. But he had reasons or excuses for why it was hard for him to hold those jobs. And he produces what is thought of as many as one of the most beautiful editions of Euclid ever produced. And it's published in 1847 by William Pickering, the Pickering Press that I mentioned earlier, with wood engraved initials by Mary Byfield working for Chisek. But it also shows some interesting things. One thing, it's the endpoint of kind of reduction of the text of Euclid to what the English market and English scholars would call it this purest form. You just need the concepts. Byrne is an interesting guy to study. He referred to himself as Her Majesty's settlements in the Falkland Islands, the surveyor of the settlements, although he never actually had that job. As I said, he moved around at jobs, but he did publish prolifically. And I will tell you a little bit more about Byrne after I hand it back over to Dr. Harris.
Thank you. So at the same time that you had this sort of development of the authority of Euclid and the Englishness of Euclid, that meant that in some ways, other sorts of geometry and other sorts of mathematics were being missed. And starting with incredibly basic ideas. And so the development of perspective in art, it actually creates a geometry that is distinct from the geometry of Euclid. And this is the geometry of actually of how we see the world. And so Euclid was the way that geometry works within Euclid, the geometry of the straight line and the compass is sort of the geometry of the world exterior to us as individuals, whereas perspective is the geometry of our perception. And it's basically the idea that instead you look at a three-dimensional world, you see a two-dimensional image, but you see it from a single point, your eye. And so if you look at a grid like this one from the side, you start to see some patterns emerging, and you would see something like this. Now in perspective, these are all the same shape, but if we think about this plane being Euclidean geometry, they're different shapes. And this authority meant that people were not exploring these other ideas as much as they might, especially in mathematics. Perspective was developed in art quite reasonably, given that it's how the world is perceived, but it's a very geometric and mathematical idea, moving from perspective to the mathematics of projective geometry. This is another of the sorts of images and that you can create with those sorts of ideas. Given that geometry also means literally the measurement of the earth, in some ways, an understanding of the sphere, how geometry might work on a sphere, is missing. Now, this is perhaps a slightly unfair accusation because there were that's what the ancient mathematics did include work on the sphere and the sphere in 3 dimensions, but not thinking about it as a 2-dimensional geometry. And this is where we can link into the sculpture that Dr. Kuhn mentioned at the beginning, the notion of thinking about geometry existing on the surface of a sphere. And just as we could think about the geometry on the surface of the sphere, we can also think about another piece of art we installed last week in the Honors College, these sorts of saddle-like surfaces. These are models of what are called hyperbolic planes, and they're sort of the reverse of the sphere. And they admit a different sort of geometry, a different understanding of geometry again, and especially all 3 of these, spherical geometry, Euclidean geometry, and hyperbolic geometry, their differences are how they handle the notion of parallel lines. And it's a bold claim to say that Euclid actually restricted the creations of these things, especially hyperbolic geometry, but let's look at how that might have happened. So in 1077, the poet, polymath, the sort of person who might enjoy, hopefully, the course that we're teaching, Omar Khayyam, more famous for the Rubaiyat, wrote a book on the difficulties in Euclid. In particular, one of those fundamental rules, sometimes called the parallel postulate. His writing went on to inspire Al-Tusi, whose work that you saw earlier in Josh's presentation. And his later work especially was written up in a book called Theory of Parallels by his son. That work was looked at by John Wallis in the 17th century, who translated it into Latin. And again, was looking at this notion of parallel, this particular axiom. And that then takes us up to the 18th century when Sakari, who explicitly was criticizing the work of Wallace and Al-Tusi, and would have seen the name of Omar Khayyam in the citations that Tusi had in diagrams that he copies almost verbatim into his own book. And what is that book called? It is called Euclid Freed of Every Flaw. Instead of trying to find these other geometries, what Sakari does is essentially create a lot of hyperbolic geometry in order to prove that it cannot exist. Why does he believe that it cannot exist? Because it's not Euclidean. The title of his book, Euclid Freed of Every Flaw, suggests that. And shifting on a little bit further in time to the early 19th century, well, in the 18th century, somebody who would have been aware of Sakari's work, Farkas Bolyai, then found his son also pursuing this work on Euclid and parallels. And he tells his son, you must not attempt this approach to parallels. I know this way to the very end. I have traversed this bottomless night, which extinguished all light and joy in my life. I entreat you, leave the science of parallels alone. I was ready to become a martyr who would remove the flaw from geometry and return it purified to mankind. Learn from my example. This shows that it was explicitly the authority of Euclid, which was holding back people from exploring these other ideas. And János Bolyai is significant because he was one of the first people to say, actually, I can find something else to construct hyperbolic geometry. He constructed a model of geometry that had a different theory of parallels. And instead of trying to remove the flaw, he showed that the flaw was itself a beautiful example of geometry. And this notion of non-Euclidean geometry, the geometry where you start to think about spheres and hyperbolic planes and other surfaces as geometry in their own right, was significant because Einstein was to come along and use exactly that mathematics. The mathematics that we've traced through Khayyam to Bolyai was then used to show that the universe is not Euclidean geometry. And we are looking at here a picture that shows how the universe is not Euclidean geometry. And the first thing to note here is that you can see this star in the middle, this bright light, which is, I think, the accretion disk of a black hole. That is, you can find that that's a lot closer than this image that we see for some reason surrounding it. So why should, if we're in Euclidean geometry, we'd be looking directly at this object, and for some reason it just happens that this big galaxy has looped itself around a particular star, and we'll do that consistently over time. But that's not what's happened. This black hole in the center has distorted and curved space-time, and so as the light travels around it, it doesn't travel in Euclidean straight lines. It travels in the shortest curves or lines that it can, and it bends around, and actually the space around this black hole acts as a lens and allows us to see deeper into the universe. And in order to understand an image like this, we had to break the tradition of Euclid. And I will finish there and let Professor Youngblood conclude.
And so we had to moved past Euclid to see the universe and to understand the universe. And we experience a revolution in scientific thinking, mathematical thinking. From the 19th century into the 20th century, our way of understanding, perceiving the universe changes. As we move past the ideals that we had, the things that we held sacrosanct, to something that is not only more applicable, but something that is refined through investigation and refined through deep critique and constant critique. So from the Platonic ideal, we move towards experimentation. To quote the professor J.J. Sylvester, a British mathematician who came to the United States in the 19th century, there are some who rank Euclid as second in sacredness to the Bible alone, and as one of the advanced outposts of the British Constitution. That is his way of saying that we have to move past Euclid, and Euclid is not sacred, and we have to question what we consider to be sacred. Now, Sylvester is also critiquing the Victorian world that he is working in, and the approach to the world as being static and in certain models and with a certain sense of propriety and with certain rules and with certain ways that things are ruled, certain people who are allowed access and certain people who are allowed to tell us what our rights are. And this is me stretching it a bit maybe, but what our rights are, what we're capable of, and how much control we can have over our lives. Sylvester is quoted in a work by Alice Jenkins, who is a literary theorist writing in the last couple of years, who, among other things, challenges us to look to the math literature of the 19th century and historicize it. Because if we don't historicize it, if we don't put math under the same lens that we would take literature from other fields, then we will continue to allow existing power structures to go uncritiqued. And back to Oliver Burns for a bit. So one of the things that he said about the creation of his version of Euclid was he was trying to teach people how to think, not what to think. Burn wanted a great deal of change in the world. He was not just a mathematician. He was someone who felt as if he was a victim of the British Empire. He felt that he was a victim of his class and his status. One of his books from 1853 was published after his partner and brother died, and called Freedom to Ireland, the Art and Science of War for the People, the pike exercises, foot lancers, light infantry, and rifle drill. He's a broad thinker and a polymath in 19th century style, but he's also someone who is trying to change the world. And he believes that the ideas that he loves so much, including Euclid's elements, will allow people to educate themselves, to seek their own truth, but also push change. So Burns' Euclid is the product of centuries and centuries of work, but it also is an example of this pivot, a social pivot, just as we saw a scientific and mathematical pivot as we seek to understand the world in a different way. So I have a couple of quotes that I'd like to end with. The first one here is from Abraham Lincoln. In the course of my law reading, I constantly came upon the word demonstrate. I thought at first that I understood its meaning, but soon became satisfied that I did not. I stayed there till I could give any propositions in the 6 books of Euclid as cite. Lincoln was known to carry an 18th century edition of Euclid around in his saddlebag as he would go to debates, but also move around the country and advance his law career and, of course, go on to be president and to oversee the Union in the most cataclysmic event in the United States in the 19th century. Lincoln would have also known that Jefferson, thinking back to Locke and modeling Locke, also had read Euclid. But when Jefferson read Euclid, he looked to propositions like Proposition 5, complex propositions, the complex ideas in Euclid as a good way of discerning which people were capable of understanding higher concepts and which weren't. Jefferson believed that only white people, and particularly Western European white people, would be capable of understanding the complexity and depth of Euclid. Lincoln thought Euclid could, and that sort of rigor in thinking and demonstrating could empower people. The last quote I hear is a little bit of a selfish quote of somebody who loves our rare books collections here. But I wanted to tie the things that we've been talking about to Arkansas, believe it or not, and to our history. And this is from an advertisement for the New Harmony Utopian city that was created in Indiana. And the ad partly says, the children are to learn mechanism by machines or exact models of them, arithmetic by machine called the arithmometer, geometry by machine called the trigonometer, by which the most useful propositions of Euclid are reduced to the comprehension of a child 5 or 6 years old. And so New Harmony was seeking to broad education. And of course, it's a utopian vision, but Euclid was essential to their approach to achieving that utopian vision. That page I had earlier from Songs of Innocence from William Blake actually includes, well, it comes from the personal library of Robert Dale Owen. Robert Dale Owen, among other things, trying to found New Harmony, also being one of the authors of the original draft of the 14th Amendment, which, if you know your US history and the Civil War, is a really, really important amendment. I was also an advocate of the rights of women to own property, run for office, and divorce. Robert Dale Owen's descendants settled in Arkansas, and his library came to us in the 1980s. And in there is this inscription and this signature mark that he had in this copy of Songs of Innocence, William Blake, which published by the same people that brought us the Burns Euclid. And so Euclid, as it was understood and transformed and transmitted over time, is not pure and not perfect. It's open to critique, and we encourage students to critique Euclid with us. But it also was instrumental in helping us understand how to demonstrate, how to think, how to embrace the axiomatic method, and how to pursue our own understanding, indeed, past Euclid. That's it.
Yowza. That was great. Wow. What an interdisciplinary romp with some really amazing characters thrown in addition to Euclid. I'm going to turn the mic over now to Dr. John Treat from the Honors College, and Dr. Treat is going to moderate Q&A. So take it away, Dr. Treat.
That was a whole lot to think of. Abraham Lincoln and Euclid. My mind is blown. So for those of you in the audience, you may either raise your hand using the icon, or if you want to put a comment in the chat, I'm happy to read it out for you. And if you're having trouble with the raised hand, you can just try to jump in. So with that, who has a question to start us off? I'll start by saying we have to discuss this later. I told my university perspectives class today that Aristotle's Ethics was the most influential book after the Bible. So
I would say there's a distinction between published and editions and how many times it's read and influential, but I'll allow your students to make that argument.
well, I'm capable of teaching them maybe something about Aristotle. I'm far less sure about Euclid at this point.
I have a question.
Excellent.
So you talked about how there was some confusion about, or they tried to make Euclid a Greek figure over time, and there were all these additions, et cetera. Did errors, I mean, there were these new understandings that came about in the 19th century, but were there errors in the math, in the geometry that crept in with all these different people copying it and creating new additions?
I sort of want to pass this question to the person sitting behind you. I know Chaim has looked a lot. I know that one of the places that there are some errors that were introduced is in the figures. I think generally, though, the mathematics, you can track some errors, but generally the mathematics went through reasonably cleanly. But interestingly, the text was clean, but the figures were often sort of, or lost their connection to the text.
Well, on that note, Edmund, so in the Arabic edition that you showed, that's like completely distorted, impossible figure of the Pythagorean, the proof of the Pythagorean theorem. Was the author unaware of what he was doing, or was that just simply a figure? I mean, that's just such a bizarre figure. Can you put that into some context?
Um,
I mean, was it?
yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, it's a great question. There were clearly people who were working and understanding what Euclid was saying. Omar Khayyam is definitely amongst them, but I think also there were people, maybe it was just being copied and not copied well. I would also wonder whether the person making the engravings for the woodblock was not the mathematician who was working primarily on the text. And so some distortions might come from that.
Yeah, so I would give the book history answer to this as well, just echo that I think I think there would have been, what you're seeing is the difference between creating a manuscript and copying a manuscript, and then having the technology to better illustrate something. And so I don't know that manuscript well, and I will say that I borrowed it from a website. And so it could be a 21st century problem with scanning. But I don't think it is. I think it's what technology do you have to create a diagram? One of the really interesting things about looking at 15th century and 16th century copies of Euclid, and then the later copies that try to emulate those perfect diagrams, is you have this combination of wood engraving, and then the invention of etching in part happens in the printed book in order to make the diagrams in the 1482 Euclid as perfect as possible. And then you have ways to manipulate and create greater architecture, book architecture within the text to frame the diagrams. One of the things that I didn't emphasize in the talk, but you might have seen it happen, is you have the marginal notes on the manuscripts. That happens in the first print editions where it's marginal notes. But then as the publishers better understand how to create the diagrams and also how to frame the diagrams and intertextually refer to them, they go into the text. And so the text becomes to frame around the diagrams, and the diagrams are better situated even within the references. And that's the Euclid that we end up getting all the way up into the 18th and 19th centuries until, of course, Byrne takes all the text out. It's just diagrams.
I see we have several students.
I would also add that one of our hopes and goals for the course is that the students take on different challenges and projects and work on this. And I think investigating exactly this question and finding out what is known about it would make a fantastic project. So if there are students in the audience and that sounded like something that you might want to know more about, that's exactly what we will be hoping that will happen during the course.
Maybe keep on with that. I see there were several students signed in tonight. So what will a day in the class look like this spring?
Well, we will have lectures and they will be rich and engaging lectures, but we will have lectures. We're also going to require some reading. So as we've said many times, and as that word will continue to be dropped, this is very intentionally interdisciplinary. So there will be readings from elements. There will be work within elements. There will also be reading from history and literary theory and classics and book history. The students will seek to better understand how books are made, to be put in a position to tackle questions that you raise, like the one you raised, Chaim. But then also they are to be moving towards their own research projects. And they'll be working with Dr. Harris and I to develop a reading list that goes beyond that as well. So we are going to have, and I'll throw this word out here, even though there's so many classicists and people that know way more about this than I do, we will have a Socratic portion to our beginning weeks where there will be a debate about the readings, but there will also be a lot of freedom, as Euclid does in many ways embody freedom, to choose your readings and to bring your own arguments about those readings forward. I will take this chat question if I could, about the portions of Euclid. So we don't have the original Euclid. That's one of the things about the book. We know little about the person. We know little about the original book. What we have are editions that date back to the 4th century. One of the Theon of Alexandria's edition from the 4th century, the Theon father of Hypatia, to add a little gender irony to this history of Euclid. But Theon's Euclid, of which it's well understood, he added some beyond what Euclid had added. But so you have Greek Euclids. Greek Euclids, they go to Byzantia and go to Constantinople before they come back to Europe. Euclid also travels through to Persia and points beyond and then comes back. And so you have Greek Euclids and you have Latin Euclids, and you have some text that survives, but there's a lot of massaging of the text together and then a correcting of them. So you have the different points, you have the axioms, you have the postulates, and all of that is edited and re-edited until we don't get, and Dr. Harris can correct me on this, a definitive critical edition until 1920.
Ooh. Excellent. Any other questions for our presenters tonight? We're at 6:30, but I think we can take one more if someone has a burning question to ask. Ah, I see a hand up.
That's me.
Oh, that's you. Dean Koo.
I enjoyed your comments about the gendered audience of Euclid. So when did it become acceptable for women to start reading Euclid? Sounds like the 19th century was not it.
You can, Joshua already mentioned Hypatia, who was one of the last of the great mathematicians of Alexandria.
Yes.
Who was definitely a woman and somebody who fought for the rights of women in the context of her day, including the legends about her, including that she would drive her own chariot, which was apparently scandalous. So
yes, sure, I do know.
I think, yes, it's really with the spread of education to both genders in the 20th century that you start to get back to something where there's at least an opening for both men and women to read Euclid. And in the 19th century, you're seeing a lot of this discussion about how mathematics in general and things like Euclid and calculus can damage and break weak female brains, especially looking at the case of Ada Lovelace. So really, it is a recent thing. The 20th century is when we see the idea that it should be equally accessible to both men and women being something that is completely open.
I guess we don't really know about medieval women as an audience fully.
I can see that Dan Sutton is holding up a book. Did you have a question, Dan?
A big book.
No, I don't really have a question. I just thought it would be fun to take a screenshot of myself holding up the book. There it is, the book.
I have a different edition next to me. Everyone hold up your Euclid.
All right. If there are no further questions, I will turn things back over to Dean Koo.
All right. Well, that was awesome. In fact, the Dean of the Libraries and I were just chatting about continuing this with some sort of faculty colloquia series, making us Honors College and Libraries intellectual hub, where we really engage faculty in this kind of really crazy interdisciplinary work. Like I said, a lot of people use that term, but very few people are actually doing it. But to bring a historian and a mathematician together, and not just in a sort of grand narrative of the history of mathematics, that's not what we're talking about here. Super cool. So that was great, y'all. Really appreciate everybody coming. Thank you, Dean Battles. Thanks for being at Arkansas and for supporting this. And of course, to Joshua and Edmund. I did have a student who had to leave a little early to go to the chess club, but he says he can't wait to sign up. So you're gonna get some crazy honors college students, I guarantee it. So, whew. All right, y'all have a good night. Thanks again for coming. That was great. That
Thanks,
really made
everybody.
my semester.
Night, everyone.
Evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, y'all.